I'm Stephen Foskett, organizer of Tech Field Day and publisher of Gestalt IT, and we're here in San Jose, California for Cloud Field Day 15. Now, we are tackling the questions around Kubernetes that everybody wants to hear. In fact, we're questioning the questions around Kubernetes. And right now, the question that comes to mind is, what even is Kubernetes? Now, if we assume that this is the future of application development, if we assume this is the future of container orchestration or the future of compute, or wait, what is it? So this is the question. Is Kubernetes a technology, a product, a platform, an idea, a set of organizing principles? I mean, what is it? Now, I know that it's a thing. I know that there is a definition of it, but increasingly, each of us is taking it in a different way and looking at it in a different way. And so I want to start off with an understanding of what it is. Now, Eric, you told us a minute ago what it is. So tell us again, what is Kubernetes?
In my opinion, and that of many others, Kubernetes is purely an API for compute. Nothing more. There's orchestration within it, there's schedulers, there are things, but ultimately it is an API for compute. And that's a narrow thing, because people say like, well, but it does compare it to vSphere. Like, no, vSphere has storage. Kubernetes doesn't have storage, it has a CSI. Kubernetes doesn't care about storage. It gives you a semantic way in which you can access storage. All it cares about is compute.
Nathan.
If that is your definition of Kubernetes, then cloud is Kubernetes.
No, because cloud has storage. Cloud natively supports distributing and access to storage and controlling access to storage. CSI does nothing. So if you schedule something in Kubernetes, what are the metrics that it uses to schedule? Latency and storage?
Yeah.
No.
Well, latency, well.
Or storage at all. Like availability of storage, yes, but purely nothing more than that. So the only metrics that will drive the orchestration, I don't mean to sound Eskil. The only metrics that will drive a decision around placement of a container is compute, memory, and CPU.
Based off of the resources that the actual pod needs, yes.
Correct.
Based off of the persistent volume and the persistent volume claim, it'll actually base that off of where that storage is and where it should be available.
I have a different view. I think Kubernetes, let's zoom out a little bit, let's squint. Kubernetes is a promise for organizations to do something in the cloud and be able to quote unquote develop software. That is what Kubernetes is to a lot of organizations. And then they realize, reality kicks in and they figure out, oh, this is an actual technology I got to implement. And, coincidentally, it's not super easy to do. But it's for a lot of organizations, it's a promise. It's a promise of a better future, not a technology.
That is
poetic. I believe that
It's magic.
It's true what you told, and there are API, of course. But when there are a complete set of API organized and complex again, it becomes an environment. So this is a complex environment that manage, of course, containers on the lower layer. But for this reason, even if not managing storage, this is cloud. So they are working on the upper layer on the cloud and then managing all the other ones. But yes, they are API, of course. So I'm in the middle.
No, and I think to expand that there's a supporting ecosystem of all the other services that tie in using a common method. So that it is a very simplified, but Kubernetes by itself, other than being the Nickelback of orchestrators, is really, it's something that you have to think of like at its core, what does Kubernetes do? If you can ship Kubernetes on anything, you can ship Kubernetes in memory only. There's a lot of things, but yeah, it is, I may be a bit sort of, but the core of it is that. What is the truth of it? It's, you look at that CNCF periodic table of things that plug into it.
Kubernetes is the path to containerization.
Right.
Yeah.
So you can, I guess it is an API. I agree with that, but it's all tied into containerization as a mechanism of packaging an application, as a mechanism of packaging the development environment.
Yeah.
I can say, I don't know if I'm wrong. It's an abstraction, right? Because you're talking about the APIs, he's talking about the cloud or cloudy way to do that, right? He's talking about an environment. I think it's a complete abstraction. When you put stuff in there, and then you don't care where your resources is running, how it's running, and so. You will simply communicate by them using the API, but yeah, respecting the rules of the environment. So for instance, you would never touch the kernel that is inside of one node or Kubernetes, right? You're simply put stuff there, and this respected the rule of abstraction. This is my point of view.
I think it's exactly right. The value that Kubernetes brings to the table is that it is a standard and a protocol, and in that abstraction. And it's not just, I think when we were saying the word API, I think some people are thinking about like the control plane API. It's actually an API below that for the whole abstraction layer, which is actually the beautiful part of this, because I can now swap out containerd for some alternate runtime for my container. I can swap out storage because of CSI. It's because it's a standard that if everyone adheres to it, there can now be innovation at each of these different levels inside of the product. And everyone's Kubernetes still talks Kubernetes, but everyone's Kubernetes is not the same.
Yeah, and that, to me, that actually is, in my mind, the most valuable thing that Kubernetes has brought to the table, is that it gives us a common language and a common framework to discuss compute, to discuss infrastructure and platforms for applications. Whereas in the past, it's always been very rooted in actual physical things. You know, when we talk about storage, we talk about a disk drive, right, or something like that. You know, but it doesn't have to be that. It's a thing. It's storage. And I think that the most powerful thing we've gotten from Kubernetes is that. Now, that doesn't mean that that's necessarily what we're using Kubernetes for. It doesn't mean that we're even using Kubernetes as the way to express that abstraction. But by having these people think about what makes up a platform for applications, it has allowed us to at least have a way to discuss the problem. Okay.
So going on that idea, which I actually very much so like, with that definition, is Kubernetes analogous to the OSI reference model?
In my mind, it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's the framework at which we're going to talk about it. In theory, you can use it in production, but I never knew anybody that like developed protocols based on OSI.
Nice.
I did, but that's a different story.
Now you're getting too nerdy on me. So this is kind of similar to what I was going to say. So we're trying to grasp as humans, this is how we learn things we know about from before. We know about VMware, we know about vSphere. But let's talk about ESXi. And
I don't.
Now, yes, you do. And you conceptually do. Let's talk about ESXi before vSphere came out. And if you remember those days, it wasn't super easy to do things, and you could only do it for one server, and you couldn't connect them together, and the networking was off the charts crazy. So when that came out, and that's why no one really trusted it as a real platform to run critical applications on, because until we got a manager called vSphere that manages ESXi hosts and pulls them together in an environment where you can install from the virtualization, where you can share the use of the you can abstract. It's a virtualization abstraction of the server. So you can share everything the server has. But if you think about what a container is the virtualization of a file system. If you've ever set up SFTP, that's where containers started. You give users a portion of access, very old, way back in the day. You give users a portion of the file system to access, and you tell them what they're allowed to access. And then they started adding on more and more and more, but you're sharing whatever is available from that piece of the file system or what you give them on the box, not the entire thing. It's an abstraction of the file system. We're at this new place, and it is analogous to VMs in the sense that and to vSphere more. I'd say Kubernetes is more like vSphere because it manages that whole system of being able to run everything y'all are saying, but it makes the idea of building and putting containers together in such a way where they can use the system's resources and what's allowed to them's resources to create an application.
Yeah. And for my mind, the problem with vSphere, the problem with virtualization was always that it was just setting up fake computers. You know, it's the same with like, what's wrong with the SAN? It's just a fake disk drive. You know, that's not what anybody asked for. Nobody asked for another fake computer. They asked for a new way of doing computing. Nathan?
Yeah, so first of all, I apologize. I didn't hear you talk about storage. And so you are right that, and you know, it's different. It's different. We know it's different.
Right on. Yeah,
So-
it was a bit of a hot take, but and I've
Yeah.
got another hot take coming when you're ready. But
Oh man, here we go. You brought up Nickelback, so help me. The other thing that I think, going back to your question, what actually is Kubernetes? I'll do this in quick story time. All cloud architects are just storytellers. If I buy, if I buy a bunch of presents for like a white elephant gift, and Amazon box arrives at my door, and I'm like, okay, here are all my presents. That's your monolithic application, right? Amazon box, a lot of different presents in it. Now I open it up and I bring all the presents out and I wrap it. Now you've got a bunch of microservices. Great. Now what are you going to do with it? Right? If you have a ton of microservices, that's just a bunch of microservices that are still going to run on a virtual machine, right? You're still probably going to run on a virtual machine. What does that do for you? Not much. Now, if I take those presents and I put them in a bag, because I got to carry it to, follow the story, got to carry it to the party, right? Now I have all of these things that I need, and I have it in this centralized location where I can actually take it and move it to where I'm actually going and get it to where I need to go, right? This, in the storyline, this is that next layer on top of the containers, which is the Kubernetes, right? We need to remember that this is just, it is at the bare minimum, it is an API, absolutely. But it also is control loops. It's also, you know, all these different disparate systems brought into the idea of control loops, automation, and orchestration. Because when we have just these individual microservices, your microservices are not going to solve the problem. The problem at the end of the day, at least as me, as an operation guy, is that I have disparate systems that have to maintain resiliency, durability, and have to keep things up because I have SLAs and SLOs I got to meet, right? By moving to Kubernetes, it's going to do a lot of that work already for me.
So that's why this is an environment, not just APIs.
Yeah, I think what Gina brought up, what Gina brought up about kind of this is, a lot of this is nothing new, which is why I think to a lot of people it sounds maybe odd or unbelievable or fantastical. But what we've done is taken something like FreeBSD jails, Solaris zones, CH roots on Linux, and we've put all the creature comforts around it that allow us to orchestrate it, allow us to do everything that Nathan just said, which is like, now it's easy to manage. It does a lot for me. I've taken the humans and put them back in the position of actually doing smart and productive work and not just busy work of keeping an application up.
But is that the answer? So you're the developer at this table. Is that the answer to the question, though? Is that even the question that developers were asking? Were they saying,
developers never ask,
boy, I wish I could have an easy way to coordinate, you know, to spin up and spin down and move around virtual containers, you know, whatever it is, you know, fake machines.
No.
Is that what I wanted?
No,
that's not what you wanted.
No.
And so that actually begs the question. So what is Kubernetes really? Is Kubernetes the answer to the question, or is it just the next answer, spinning up and spinning down fake servers?
Well, first of all, I think your question is incorrect, because the question isn't to the developer, hey, do you care about spinning up and spinning down fake servers? The question to the developer is, hey, do you want to develop your stuff and release it a lot faster, right? And do you want to be able to release it with the availability to know that when you release it, blue-green deployments are automatically built in. That is how rollouts work in Kubernetes. It will always roll out in a blue-green deployment, right? Now, if you want to do canaries and other things, you can do that stuff. I'm not saying you can't, but those factors and those orchestrations are already built into Kubernetes. So a developer wanting to develop things and move at a faster speed, rather than taking something off of his laptop and shooting it into the void and saying, please push this and make it done by Friday so my boss doesn't get mad at me. You know, maybe a developer is happy with that until it gets to Monday. He has to say, okay, why isn't this pushed? And why is my manager mad at me?
That is 100% it. The developer, only thing the developer cares about is shipping their code and knowing they can reship it faster again. And if there's an issue, they can roll it back instantaneously. I mean, how else can we enable organizations like I know I've talked to folks at Instagram about how they deploy 700-800 changes per day get released into their production environment. Do that without a container.
Yeah,
I think that there is a point that we are discussing, well, we are not discussing, and also on the previous question, maybe we are discussing about Kubernetes, but the real question is, are we going towards DevOps, or is it just a buzzword? Because as far as I heard here, there's still a chasm between them. And I never thought, I'm a versatile guy, I never thought to put my hands coding, never. I should now, I should start now. And the same, Calvin, you never thought to put your hands on networks or on infrastructure at all, and you shouldn't.
No, I have. I'm an old school sysadmin too.
Okay.
But...
So the point is that a developer should know how put their applications in network. I'm fine, of course. And an infrastructure guy should know how to scale up, scale down, writing on YAML, JSON, what is this? So I don't think it's still, we are reaching the DevOps environment.
I think one thing I'd like to add to this discussion, and it goes back to vSphere, it goes back to ESXi, it goes back to diffusion of innovation. New technologies always start out primitive. They're hard to use. They offer some small segment of groups an advantage. The guys that want to do, 1,000 units scalability and stuff like that. Over time, those technologies get more and more of an ecosystem around them that make them easier and easier to use. And that's how they move up this chasm to some extent from, the bleeding edge kind of guys like us to the, early adopters to the main users and stuff like that. So the ecosystem will become easier for Kubernetes over time. And the fact that Kubernetes runs on just about anything in the world today, I can't believe that that's an indicator of the fact that it's way beyond the chasm.
I think this is a really good point, and why I'm sort of strict on when I say what is Kubernetes. Kubernetes is an API for compute, because Kubernetes ecosystem is 100% what will enable it to have far across the chasm, because it's what you do with it. Because the core of it is very simple. And the advantage is there's VMware has a Kubernetes set of tooling. Cisco has a set of Kubernetes tooling. It's upstream Kubernetes. They've not forked it. They've not done anything. It in its core is the very simple. It is the tooling that they're creating an ecosystem around. There's obviously some DRS-y type of things built into it, but Kubernetes at its core, what you're really having is OpenShift, which is going to be, I want to push code to Git. Git's going to go to OpenShift. It's going to deploy it. It's going to automatically do all my things. It's going to run my tests. Done and done. They don't actually care that it's Kubernetes. They care that it's OpenShift. And then what happens when you add KubeVirt? We can run fully functional traditional virtual machines and be orchestrated by Kubernetes. Typically, it's being seen as an anti-pattern to Kubernetes because it's not a container. But at its core, it's a simple thing that will do it. Like the ecosystem is going to be stronger. Kubernetes is already here.
That's an open source answer, completely up and down all the way through. And I do not think that's the answer. I think the answer is containers. I mean, the more I go through this survey, developers, they surveyed 5,000. Most of them, a third of them didn't want to use Kubernetes. They don't care about Kubernetes, but over half of them use containers. It's a container answer. And whoever builds the container management system, or however we want to call it, this way that is easy to deploy and easy not only for SREs to develop, but for operators to get their teeth into and figure out how do we make this scale the way it's supposed to. That's what's going to win. And my bet is that it won't be an open source. My bet is somebody's building it right now and it'll come out and have lots of resources to hire people, and it will take over.
Well, and that's I guess
is that a premonition?
That's my premonition.
I guess that's consistent though with the history of enterprise tech though, because enterprises really do. I mean, the old joke, they want somebody, throat to choke, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's a horrible metaphor for one thing, but also it's not really true. But what is true is that they want sort of supportable, roll it out, make it happen solutions. And they've never really liked, let's go build this kind of solutions. Even enterprise development, software development isn't really software development as much as it is stitching together components, in many cases purchased components. And so I completely agree with you there. I think that the benefits of containerization are absolutely undeniable. Anyone who's worked as a systems administrator all the way up through to be a developer can see the benefits of containerization, because modern applications are made up of so many components, and you have to have those components, that component set be consistent. You have to have the entire environment that application runs in be consistent. And the amazing thing about containers, and Calvin and I were talking about this earlier, is with Python, is just how amazing it is that you can know for 100% certain that the environment my application is running in is going to be consistent, whether it's on my laptop or in production. And so containers are absolutely marvelous for that. But if Kubernetes is really all about orchestrating containers, then again, I will pose the question, is that the thing? Is that really?
I would say that you're on the right path, that the real win, and to Gina's point, what will succeed is OpenShift Kubernetes.
Yes.
It happened,
Yes.
no.
Yes.
Yes,
It
it is.
runs on Kubernetes, but it didn't.
It is using the protocols,
shows-
the standards. That's the benefit of Kubernetes here, is you actually get to have opinions about which pieces you want to bring along for the ride. in
Now that's the
Kubernetes.
trick, the opinionated overlay.
Yeah.
It's an
So,
opinionated
but
Kubernetes.
if we say OpenShift itself, is an
Right.
opinionated overlay that uses Kubernetes as an underlay delivery mechanism. But 7 years ago, it was not Kubernetes. OpenShift
Yeah.
came with its own containerization platform, its own scheduler, its
Run
own.
your cartridges.
That's right, right. And is Rancher Kubernetes? Is D2IQ Kubernetes? It wasn't, right? It was Marathon and Mesosphere. I'm the only person that doesn't have a hashicorp.com email addresses that talks about Nomad. It's the best, it's hands down scientifically, intellectually the best scheduler in the market today. It's being used by massive organizations. However, not Kubernetes, so it's not going to win.
I will cage match this discussion because it is Kubernetes. I think that's because my definition of Kubernetes is an orchestration layer for containers. Nomad, to your point, is most assuredly not Kubernetes. Now you said 7 years ago, OpenShift wasn't Kubernetes. Of course it wasn't Kubernetes, because Kubernetes came around 2014.
Well, sorry, but Kubernetes did exist for 2 years in parallel to a completely standalone system. Even
Exactly.
Foundry had Warden.
Let's not get
all these
into
different things, right?
Let's not get into the history of Kubernetes, because there was battle between Kubernetes, Docker Swarm, and all these other solutions that were out there, right?
Right.
But we do see Kubernetes as being the adoption layer that is now being used for OpenShift, for Tanzu, for D2IQ,
right.
Because what they're actually doing is they're deploying what they refer to as opinionated Kubernetes clusters.
Okay.
Now, this is the next iteration of what we're seeing from Kubernetes, which is, like Gina said it as well, that's an OpenShift, that's an open source solution answer, right? Because if you go to the enterprise, they want support. They don't want to have to hire 30 people just to make sure their Kubernetes cluster stays up, because they're running it on KubeADM and all the different open source solutions. They want support that's going to actually help them across the entire cluster, make sure that it's running well. That's where OpenShift comes in. That's where Tanzu comes in. That's where D2IQ comes in. Now, in an operations world, I would love to have the ability to say, okay, give me everything that I want. Give me my networking, give me my storage, give me my compute, and make it all the way that I want it to be, and give me just a little bit extra freedom to build what I want on top of that. And that's kind of that same kind of like, woohoo, here you go. And I'm sure people can come to me and say, well, that's what Outpost does. That's what Azure Stack is. To a certain degree, sure. But to what Kubernetes gives to, and I'm getting off topic, but where Kubernetes is actually hitting these different areas is the ability to grant all of the solutions that you need without having to immediately get KubeADM cluster deployed and it not work because you didn't install your CNI yet.
Finally, I think we actually answered our first panel question, which is that sounds like we are all in violent agreement now that Kubernetes is in fact the standard and is widely accepted and it's crossed the chasm.
Yeah, I knew that.
I think so.
That conclusion was correct.
But I do like, it's always funny because I like the enterprise opinionated method. What surprises me about Kubernetes when I looked at OpenStack, because I'm dumb enough to have hung onto that tail for a while. OpenStack, what ended up happening, every Cisco, VMware, whatever, created their own completely, not just opinionated, but forked, unique implementation based on some subset, but they started creating their own code. But every single Kubernetes derivative enterprise platform today is based on vanilla upstream Kubernetes, which is a big change in how it's going to do. Yeah, so I'd say this idea of arguing over objective truth and misinformation, and we spend the first 45 minutes arguing what truth is.
I mean,
as a phrase, but like, so
That's
Kubernetes,
importantly what we're talking about, because I mean, we get something that's put out to us that started the whole journey from a survey that the person that authored the article didn't even bother to go look and see what the story was. And the whole premise of that article was on a quote in a survey, and he doesn't know how the survey was conducted. That means you can say anything you want and throw it out there because you're an advocate of these things that everybody believes you without questioning it. No, we have to question it, and we have to talk about the definitions. That's what this is what Tech Field Day is. Cloud Field Day is, this is what we do. And I think that it's important because then we come to this level set where, okay, we understand the technologies. We're kind of all in agreement about that now, I think. And then we try to move forward. But I think that's what our job is as as delegates, is to get that level set, and not just to believe things we read on the internet, guys.
oh, I totally agree.
to your point, Gina, you were like, I will put this on a sticker. I will tattoo it on my chest. Or
Oh,
trans
Lord,
camp-
mercy.
But
Challenge accepted.
the point that you made, that if whoever does make containers more adoptable, more operational, or more fill in all the gaps for containers to be able to be the solution, that is going to be the next iteration. And because containers is pretty well accepted, Kubernetes is not. But Kubernetes is by definition the orchestration on top of Kubernetes, right? And so there's something missing there that we see in other areas.
Replace the word adoptable with profitable, and I think you got the right statement.
Profitable, adoptable, when it's packaged in a nice sweet box that's got SLAs and service agreements, all that good stuff. Enterprises like that, right? Because if something goes wrong, they go back to their service agreement and they say, hey, you promised us this and this isn't what happened.
Life is like a box of APIs.
Yes, it is.
So at the risk of opening up a can of worms, there is an enterprise company that did package Kubernetes in a very enterprise-friendly way, and it's called Tanzu.
I gotta leave.
Now, honestly, when I looked at that, I was thinking pretty much what Pumla is saying. As an enterprise, I'm going to look at that and I'm going to say, well, I got to get me some of that Kubernetes, but there's no way I can drink it unfiltered, right? I can't have raw Kubernetes in the enterprise. But Tanzu was extremely enterprise friendly, and Tanzu has had, from what I hear, zero adoption among big companies. So did we just not give it enough time, or was it the wrong product?
I could say, I think it's a big shame. And coming from VMware and being gone long enough, I think it's okay for me to say they marketed to the wrong audience.
I'm going to agree with you on that one. Yes.
Is not developers. Developers do not, you're the developers, you tell me. Developers do not want to build and maintain the infrastructure. They had,
no, in fact, that's exactly what they don't want.
Exactly. Yeah. They had the audience in their hands. The vAdmins will learn this. The vAdmins of these days will go forward and be the ones that manage containers in whatever form it is. And they were so disdainful and did not want to say, let us teach you this little bridging piece you need to understand, which you probably did in your early sysadmin days, but that's okay. We'll get you there, and use all of those workloads that they had captive with vSphere, and they just gave it away to the hyperscalers, honestly.
Yeah, you're right.
Marketing.
Yep.
So
I agree with Gina. She's right.
Thank you.
He completely, because she completely lack on marketing and communication.
Yeah.
So they still have a discussion with DevOps, and so put stuff there because it's beauty. You can give okay, but as a developer, I take care only the code I built, right? I don't care if you stay there, stay in another class, because it's not my business, right? And for this reason, I see, let me say that VMware comes to Kubernetes space too late, right? We have seen Kubernetes products come to the market before VMware finally with Tanzu, go to a serious product that can be integrated and can be managed. And the goal for Tanzu is that you have vSphere admin, you're right. You are completely on this platform, right? Then, if you don't have it, you have to close a gap, a cultural gap for vSphere admins, right?
But this is something that I already heard about VMware. I started my job living on VMware, but it sounds me like VMware on AWS, something like if you cannot fight, let them friend. So VMware on AWS. So now containers, how could we take people over our platform? Okay, Tanzu, it's not the best platform. The market asks for OpenShift, for example.
Yeah.
But well, marketing people from VMware is a great business unit. So they put it on. They made it available together with other customers, and yeah. And okay, I will shut that.
No,
But okay.
Nathan is eager to say something.
Well, so just to wrap it.
This is why we've got wrapped between us now, because Nathan's going to start.
Well, so just maybe they justify this with okay, your customer of VMware, you can have together virtual machines and containers. You can make them communicate with not so hard way, NSXT. Okay, you have it, and everything is in the same environment. But maybe it's not the best, and maybe it wasn't the real.
I'll add my one quick package hot take is that Tanzu Kubernetes Grid is simply a Trojan horse to get NSX into your environment. So there you go, Nathan.
Okay, first of all, that is no longer a requirement, so you are wrong. Second of all, we need to see what Tanzu is now to give them kind of a little bit of grace, because when it was first released, yeah, it was terrible. It broke so insanely easy. It was a Trojan horse to get NSX installed because you had no other CNIs that you could use. If you didn't have that, guess what? You weren't able to do it.
And we should probably also couch it as Tanzu Kubernetes Grid versus Tanzu Mission Control, which is a different thing about the manager of managers and whatever. People often get sort of like, I know what you're talking about, but when someone watches, they'll be like, oh.
If we zoom out, when we say Tanzu, Tanzu is a suite of services. And you have Tanzu Observability, which is the ability to see things. You have Tanzu Mission Control, which is the ability to manage Kubernetes clusters running the Tanzu Kubernetes solution across multiple different areas, right? So AKS, EKS, and GKE. I can deploy Tanzu clusters across those with governance across those clusters, which is incredibly awesome. And then you have other solutions like TAP and TKO around basically like how to basically operationalize and create an application development centric around it. Now, throw all that stuff out and get back to the point. When we're talking about Tanzu, we immediately go into, okay, Tanzu Kubernetes Grid on-premise Tanzu. And what Gina said is absolutely 100% right. They marketed it to the wrong people. And I don't know who they were supposed to market it to. And that's my response to that, because what it realistically became was a way for the operator and the developer to work in, I like to think of it like they were like an orchestra. They were playing different instruments, but they were playing on the same sheet of music. They were able to see what the other person was doing without them having to tell each other what they were doing. If I'm an operator and I deploy and I see a developer deploy a cluster and start consuming resources, great. I gave them the resources that they were supposed to consume. They're able to consume those resources, great. If they deploy a vSphere pod, which is in a lot of different ways, kind of just like a virtual machine, and I'm an operator, I can see that being spun up, right? If I see them deploy a cluster, I see the cluster deployed, but I don't see the pods deployed, right? Because I'm an operator. I don't care what is being consumed outside of the resources within my cluster, right? And so the idea that we're talking about vSphere and we're talking about Tanzu specifically, now I think they're in a very great position because they have a universality around their runtime, which they just announced a couple months back. So if you're running Tanzu Kubernetes Grid local and you run in TMZ, you're literally running the same opinionated solution, which I haven't seen that with other competitors. And that's something that needs to be brought up more often, because when we're talking about the ability to run a container, we don't want to just run a container in one location. We wanted the ability to just export that and say, okay, this one died. I'm going to spin up another cluster somewhere else and then push that container over there. And now this one's live, right? That's the versatility and the resiliency that they can use. And I'll stop there.
No, I think that there is an alternative here that we've not talked about, is a tool like EKS Anywhere. If you want to say we're going to speak to the operations teams and speak to the developers and speak to being able to run on the edge, I think Amazon actually made a real win there with offering that up. There was an announcement last reInvent that you can now do EKS Anywhere, and you have the same APIs now to interact with EKS part of it, obviously the Kubernetes control plane part of it, and it's all standard. It's all part of the protocol, and it speaks to both audiences.
So I want to wrap though on this question though, because we talked about Tanzu, we talked about OpenShift, we talked about EKS and GKS and all these other things. But the question that I started this with is, what is Kubernetes anyway? And my question, I guess, quite simply is, are these things Kubernetes? When we say that word, do we mean Tanzu? Do we mean EKS? Do we mean Rancher? Or do we mean exactly Kubernetes, like what the box is, right? And I think that that's actually a really important question, really important thought for all of us, because when we're trying to conceptualize this market and figure out kind of where we stand in this, and you know, we need to know whether Kubernetes is just the thing that says Kubernetes on it, or whether Kubernetes is a name for this entire new way of doing, you know, DevOps infrastructure. So I'm going to ask y'all, when you hear Kubernetes and when you think of Kubernetes, again, lightning round again, we'll start over here this time. When you think of Kubernetes, does it mean the thing that is definitely Kubernetes, like meaning let's exclude K3s, let's exclude Tanzu, like or does it mean the big picture of the world that is built on Kubernetes, or maybe not even built on Kubernetes, but kind of is built on Kubernetes? Do we start with that? So again, I'm going to start over here with the question. I guess say big or small. So
yeah.
So when you think of when somebody says Kubernetes, do you think the small thing that says Kubernetes or the big world?
The small, technically the small piece of, the core.
Absolutely, the smallest portion. There's opinionated overlays. If VMware bought San Pellegrino tomorrow, this would be called Tanzu Water the next day. That doesn't mean that Tanzu is water, but so yeah, I'm going to go small.
Okay,
I agree with them, both of them.
All right, the three Italians.
wait, what did you say?
Yeah, I'm going to say big, because at the end of the day, if I'm running a Kubernetes cluster in one area, I want to understand that what those functions are. So I know what water is, and I know what water looks like. But if I'm looking around for water, and it doesn't matter to me what the label is, I'm looking for water.
Okay, big or small, Ray?
Kubernetes is the solution that won the orchestration wars. I mean, there was half a dozen different components out there, all trying to vie for who's the right orchestrator. Containers were underlying technology for all of them, and Kubernetes won it. It's big.
Big unless there's context that says otherwise.
Big as well. It's a giant concept that has to, be broken down to smaller parts.
What he said, I agree with that.
All right,
Big, it's about the developer experience.
the developer experience.
Big. Yeah.
All right.
What he said.
I'm gonna go
Yeah.
with the big, but I think that's really the full ecosystem of that abstraction that gives and empowers all this reliable, repeatable delivery of the actual application, which is where the real value is.
And I'm going to agree with y'all on the big side. From my perspective, Kubernetes is more an idea than a product or a specific set of tools. And I think that when we talk about it, we mean conceptually the idea of orchestrated containers and the API and the environment that allows those orchestrated containers to work. And therefore, again, I'm going to throw a little curveball in here at the end. I suspect that long term, what is going to be Kubernetes is actually not going to be Kubernetes at all. It'll just be called Kubernetes, and it'll do roughly the same thing. And I think that's what's going to end up winning.